Picture this: a Spanish prince so desperate for power that he orchestrated a coup against his own father, the reigning king. But Ferdinand VII's betrayal of Carlos IV in 1808 wasn't just political opportunism. It was the first glimpse into a mind so twisted, so devoid of basic human decency, that it would shock even the most cynical European courts of his era. The mutiny of Aranjuez wasn't some noble uprising against tyranny. It was a calculated family destruction planned by a son who couldn't wait for his father to die naturally. Ferdinand didn't just want the throne. He wanted to humiliate the man who gave him life, strip him of dignity, and watch him grovel for mercy. The young prince gathered conspirators not with promises of better governance, but with whispered assurances that Carlos IV's downfall would be personally satisfying to witness. When the mob stormed the royal palace, Ferdinand stood watching as his terrified father was dragged from his chambers in his nightclothes. Court witnesses later testified that Ferdinand smiled during his father's humiliation. Not the grim satisfaction of political necessity, but the genuine pleasure of a predator watching prey suffer. Carlos IV, the man who had clothed, fed, and prepared Ferdinand for kingship, was forced to abdicate while his son watched with visible enjoyment. But Ferdinand's cruelty toward his father went beyond mere political calculation. He ordered Carlos IV's closest advisors arrested and tortured, not for state secrets, but to extract confessions about his father's private humiliations. The new king wanted detailed accounts of every moment of weakness, every personal failure, every embarrassing incident from his father's reign. He collected his father's shame like trophies. The most disturbing detail emerged years later from palace servants. After Carlos IV's abdication, Ferdinand ordered his father's personal belongings burned in the courtyard, while the deposed king watched from a window. Family portraits, personal letters, gifts from his deceased wife. Everything that represented Carlos IV's identity as a man, not just a king, reduced to ash while his son supervised the destruction. When Napoleon arrived in Spain and summoned both father and son to Bayonne, Ferdinand saw an opportunity to complete his father's destruction. He didn't just betray Carlos IV to the French emperor. He provided Napoleon with intimate details about his father's weaknesses, personal fears, and health problems. Information only a son would know, weaponized against the man who raised him. The meeting in Bayonne revealed the full extent of Ferdinand's depravity. While Carlos IV begged Napoleon for mercy, Ferdinand actively encouraged the emperor to treat his father harshly. Palace records show Ferdinand suggesting specific humiliations that would be most painful for his father to endure. He turned his own flesh and blood into entertainment for a foreign conqueror. But here's where Ferdinand's story takes an even darker turn. His betrayal of his father was just practice for what he would do to an entire nation. While Ferdinand was imprisoned by Napoleon in the luxurious chateau of Valençay, European diplomats began receiving disturbing reports about the Spanish prince's behavior. What they discovered wasn't just personal debauchery. It was a systematic approach to sexual exploitation that would make a sultan's harem look restrained by comparison. Ferdinand had converted entire wings of the French chateau into what can only be described as a personal brothel. But these weren't professional courtesans or willing participants. They were servants, minor nobility, and even the wives of other Spanish prisoners, all coerced into sexual slavery by a man who held their families' lives in his hands. The French guards, initially amused by their prisoners' appetites, grew increasingly uncomfortable with what they witnessed. The system Ferdinand created was methodically cruel. He would identify women in vulnerable positions, single mothers serving as chambermaids, wives of imprisoned Spanish officials, daughters of families dependent on royal favor. Then he would manufacture crises that made their survival dependent on his personal protection. A servant's son would suddenly face charges of theft. A nobleman's wife would discover her husband's execution was being considered. And Ferdinand would appear as the only person who could solve these problems for a price. French diplomatic correspondence from this period, sealed for over a century, reveals the full scope of Ferdinand's sexual predation. He maintained detailed written records of each woman's submission, including their emotional breakdowns, pleas for mercy, and descriptions of their humiliation. These weren't the casual encounters of a bored prisoner. They were calculated psychological destruction, documented like scientific experiments. The chateau's staff reported finding women sobbing in corridors, some bearing visible bruises, others withdrawn into complete silence. When questioned by French authorities, these women would only say they were serving the Spanish king's needs. The psychological control Ferdinand exerted was so complete that his victims defended their own abuse rather than risk losing his protection. But Ferdinand's sexual depravity went beyond simple exploitation. He developed elaborate rituals designed to maximize his victims' psychological suffering. Women would be forced to participate in mock ceremonies where they symbolically renounced their previous lives, their marriages, their children. He made them repeat phrases acknowledging their complete dependence on his mercy while performing sexual acts that left them psychologically shattered. The most disturbing aspect was Ferdinand's apparent belief that he was entitled to this behavior. Letters to Spanish allies reveal his casual references to maintaining royal privileges and preserving monarchical prerogatives, while describing activities that constituted systematic rape. He genuinely believed his royal blood granted him unlimited access to any woman within his reach. When news of Ferdinand's behavior reached the Spanish resistance fighting Napoleon, many initially dismissed the reports as French propaganda. The idea that their imprisoned king was voluntarily degrading himself and others seemed impossible to believe. But as more witnesses came forward, the resistance leadership faced a horrifying reality. They weren't fighting to restore a noble monarch. They were fighting to return a sexual predator to unlimited power. The French eventually moved Ferdinand to different quarters, not out of moral concern for his victims, but because his activities were creating administrative problems. Too many pregnancy scares, too many suicide attempts, too many Spanish prisoners requesting transfers away from their supposed king. Napoleon's officials decided Ferdinand's sexual appetite was interfering with the smooth management of their Spanish prisoners. But the damage was done. Ferdinand had established a pattern of sexual exploitation that would follow him back to Spain, where he would have not just imprisoned women to victimize, but an entire nation of subjects with no legal protection from their king's appetites. The man Spain welcomed as their returning hero had spent his captivity perfecting techniques of sexual terrorism that would soon be unleashed on Spanish soil. When Ferdinand VII returned to Madrid in 1814, Spanish citizens expected their restored king to bring justice and healing to a war-torn nation. Instead, they got a monarch whose years of imprisonment had twisted his mind into something genuinely monstrous. Ferdinand didn't just restore the Inquisition. He turned it into his personal entertainment system, a theater of cruelty where he held season tickets to human suffering. The newly restored king's first royal decree wasn't about rebuilding Spain or helping war victims. It was establishing a special wing in the royal palace where he could observe interrogations and executions in comfort. Ferdinand ordered the construction of hidden viewing chambers connected to the main torture rooms, complete with cushioned seating and refreshment service. He wanted to watch people break, and he wanted to do it in luxury. Palace servants who were forced to attend these sessions left behind testimonies that read like descriptions of hell. Ferdinand would arrive for torture sessions dressed in his finest clothes, treating the human agony below like an opera performance. He would applaud particularly creative torture techniques, request encores of especially effective methods, and even suggest improvements to the interrogators. The king, who couldn't govern effectively, had found his true calling in orchestrating human misery. The Inquisition records, sealed until the 20th century, reveal Ferdinand's personal involvement in selecting victims. He didn't just approve execution lists. He studied them like a gourmand reviewing a restaurant menu, choosing which cases to attend based on the promised entertainment value. Young women accused of witchcraft received his special attention, as did former supporters of the liberal constitution who had believed in human rights and dignity. Ferdinand developed favorite torture methods the same way other people develop favorite books or foods. The garrucha, where victims were suspended by ropes tied to their wrists behind their backs, became his preferred appetizer. The potro, a rack that slowly dislocated every joint in the body, served as his main course. and public burnings provided the dramatic finale he craved. He treated human agony like a carefully planned meal, savoring each course. But Ferdinand's sadism went beyond mere observation. He began issuing specific instructions to his torturers, requesting modifications to traditional techniques based on his personal interests. Court records show orders for enhanced interrogation of female prisoners and extended preliminary procedures for victims he found particularly attractive. The king was customizing torture to satisfy his own twisted sexual appetites. The psychological profile that emerges from these records is terrifying in its calculated cruelty. Ferdinand kept detailed journals of his observations, rating different torture sessions like a critic reviewing theatrical performances. He wrote about victims' facial expressions, the sounds they made, the exact moment when hope left their eyes. These weren't the ravings of a madman. They were the methodical notes of someone who had turned human suffering into a science. Spanish nobles, who were forced to attend these spectacles as part of their court duties, began showing signs of severe psychological trauma. Several committed suicide rather than continue witnessing their king's entertainment preferences. Others fled the country, claiming they could no longer serve a monarch who had become indistinguishable from the devil himself. The most disturbing aspect was Ferdinand's apparent belief that his behavior was not only acceptable but divinely sanctioned. He would begin each torture session with prayers, thanking God for the opportunity to cleanse Spain of impurity. In his twisted mind, every scream was a hymn, every broken body an offering to divine justice. He had created a theology of torture with himself as high priest. By 1816, even Ferdinand's own ministers were privately expressing concern about their king's psychological state. Foreign ambassadors began sending coded reports to their governments, warning that Spain was being ruled by someone who appeared to be genuinely insane. But Ferdinand's control over the Inquisition made him untouchable. Anyone who questioned his methods risked becoming his next entertainment. The man who had betrayed his father and exploited imprisoned women had found his ultimate expression of power. In the torture chambers of restored Spain, Ferdinand VII wasn't just a king. He was a god of pain, and every scream was worship. Ferdinand VII's approach to marriage revealed the same calculated cruelty he brought to governing Spain, except his wives had no escape route and no allies to protect them. By the time his fourth wedding ceremony concluded, European courts were quietly asking the same question. Was the Spanish king systematically murdering his wives, or was he simply the unluckiest husband in royal history? His first wife, Maria Antonia of Naples, arrived in Spain in 1802 as a cheerful 17-year-old princess who had been raised to believe marriage to Ferdinand would be the beginning of a fairy tale life. Spanish court records reveal that within months of their wedding, Maria Antonia's letters home began describing a husband whose behavior terrified her. She wrote about Ferdinand's sudden rages, his obsession with controlling her every movement, and his disturbing sexual demands that left her physically injured and emotionally shattered. Maria Antonia's death at age 21 was officially attributed to tuberculosis, but her personal physician's private notes tell a different story. She had been healthy before her marriage, with no family history of respiratory illness. But after 3 years with Ferdinand, her immune system had collapsed completely. The doctor noted suspicious bruising on her throat and wrists, along with evidence of repeated physical trauma that weakened her body's ability to fight infection. Ferdinand's behavior during Maria Antonia's final illness was particularly revealing. Instead of staying by her bedside or summoning the best medical care, he spent her dying days planning his next wedding. Palace servants testified that Ferdinand was already negotiating with Portuguese diplomats about his second marriage, while his first wife was still breathing her last breaths. He treated his dying wife like a business contract that was about to expire. His second wife, Isabel of Braganza, lasted only 2 years. She arrived from Portugal in 1816 as a vibrant 19-year-old known for her intelligence and strong will. Spanish courtiers initially hoped she might have a positive influence on Ferdinand, perhaps tempering his cruelest impulses. Instead, they watched her transform from a confident young woman into a terrified shadow who jumped at sudden noises and refused to be alone with her husband. Isabel's private diary, discovered after her death, reveals the systematic psychological torture Ferdinand inflicted on his wives. He would wake her at random hours to interrogate her about imaginary infidelities, force her to watch torture sessions as education in royal justice, and threaten to have her family members arrested if she displeased him. The diary entries show a gradual breakdown of her sanity under the constant stress of living with a man who seemed to enjoy her fear. When Isabel died at age 21, the official cause was given as sudden fever, but her autopsy, performed secretly by a Portuguese physician, revealed evidence of poisoning. High levels of mercury and arsenic in her hair and fingernails suggested systematic administration over several months. Ferdinand had apparently been dosing his wife with poison while maintaining the facade of a loving husband, concerned about her mysterious illness. His third wife, Maria Josefa Amalia of Saxony, met the same fate in 1829. She survived only 8 months of marriage, dying at age 25 under circumstances so suspicious that several European courts began privately discussing intervention. The Saxon princess had been warned about Ferdinand's history by her family, but royal marriages weren't matters of personal choice. She arrived in Madrid knowing she might be walking into a death trap. Maria Josefa's brief marriage left behind the most disturbing evidence of Ferdinand's pattern of wife abuse. She had secretly written letters to her sister describing Ferdinand's games, which involved elaborate psychological torture designed to break her spirit completely. He would stage mock executions where she was forced to watch actors portraying her family members being killed. He made her participate in humiliating sexual rituals, while threatening to have her declared insane if she resisted. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to see it. Ferdinand didn't just marry women, he collected them like hunting trophies, enjoying the process of breaking them down systematically before disposing of them. Each wife's death followed the same trajectory. Initial resistance, gradual psychological breakdown, mysterious illness, and convenient demise just as Ferdinand was growing bored with his current victim. By the time Ferdinand married his fourth wife, Maria Cristina of Naples, in 1829, European courts were essentially watching a slow-motion execution. The difference was that Maria Cristina proved tougher than her predecessors. She survived Ferdinand's psychological warfare long enough to give him 2 daughters and outlive him by decades. Her survival was not due to Ferdinand becoming less cruel, but rather to her own remarkable resilience and the fact that Ferdinand's own health was failing too rapidly for him to complete his usual pattern of spousal destruction. The collected testimonies of servants, physicians, and court officials paint a picture of a man who had turned marriage into a formalized system of domestic terrorism. Ferdinand didn't want wives. He wanted victims with royal titles, women he could destroy slowly and legally while maintaining the facade of a proper Catholic monarch. Each wedding was simply Ferdinand restocking his private torture chamber with a new subject for his psychological experiments. By 1820, Ferdinand VII's mind had deteriorated into something resembling a horror novel, more than a functioning monarchy. The man who had spent years perfecting the art of torture and wife murder had developed a paranoia so complete, so all-consuming, that he began seeing enemies in every shadow and conspiracies in every conversation. What followed was the systematic destruction of everyone who had ever supported him, trusted him, or believed in the Spanish crown. Ferdinand's paranoia manifested first in his treatment of the military officers who had restored him to power in 1814. These were men who had risked their lives fighting Napoleon's forces, who had sacrificed everything to return their king to the throne. Ferdinand repaid their loyalty by having them systematically arrested, tortured, and executed on fabricated charges of treason. He couldn't bear the thought that anyone might claim credit for his restoration, so he erased them from existence. General Francisco Esposi Mina, one of Spain's greatest war heroes, found himself branded a traitor simply because his popularity threatened Ferdinand's ego. The king ordered Mina's arrest based on evidence that existed only in Ferdinand's increasingly deranged imagination. When Mina's supporters protested, Ferdinand had them arrested too. The paranoia was spreading like a plague through the Spanish government, consuming anyone who showed independence or competence. But Ferdinand's suspicions weren't limited to political rivals. He began turning against his own family members with the same methodical cruelty he had shown his wives. His brother Carlos, who had supported Ferdinand's claim to the throne and served loyally as his advisor, suddenly found himself under constant surveillance. Ferdinand ordered his own brother's correspondence intercepted, his servants bribed to report private conversations, and his movements tracked like a common criminal. The breaking point came when Ferdinand discovered that Carlos had privately expressed concern about the king's mental state to a trusted confessor. This wasn't treason or conspiracy. It was a brother's genuine worry about a sibling who was clearly losing his grip on reality. Ferdinand's response was to order Carlos placed under house arrest and begin preparing charges that would justify his execution. Only Carlos's strategic retreat into exile prevented Ferdinand from adding fratricide to his growing list of atrocities. Ferdinand's paranoia extended to the Spanish Church, the institution that had provided the ideological foundation for his absolute monarchy. When Archbishop Rafael de Vélez suggested that perhaps the king's methods were becoming too extreme for Christian conscience, Ferdinand immediately suspected a clerical conspiracy against his rule. He ordered the archbishop's quarters searched for evidence of treasonous correspondence and began investigating other church leaders for signs of disloyalty. The Spanish economy, already devastated by the Napoleonic Wars, collapsed completely under the weight of Ferdinand's paranoid governance. He couldn't trust merchants, so trade ground to a halt under excessive surveillance and arbitrary confiscations. He couldn't trust regional governors, so he replaced them so frequently that no one could maintain consistent policies. He couldn't trust his own treasury officials, so Spain's finances became a maze of contradictory orders and abandoned projects. By 1823, Ferdinand's paranoia had become so complete that he was essentially ruling Spain from a bunker mentality. He rarely left the royal palace, surrounding himself with layers of guards whose loyalty was maintained through terror rather than respect. The king, who had once enjoyed public torture spectacles, now lived in constant fear that any gathering of more than 3 people might be plotting his assassination. The Revolution of 1820, when liberal forces briefly restored constitutional government, was less a political uprising than a collective nervous breakdown by a nation that couldn't endure Ferdinand's paranoid tyranny any longer. Even his most conservative supporters had begun questioning whether absolute monarchy was worth the psychological torture of serving a king who trusted no one and suspected everyone. Ferdinand's response to the liberal revolution revealed the full extent of his mental deterioration. Instead of negotiating or seeking compromise, he went into complete psychological collapse, alternately begging his captors for mercy and threatening them with divine retribution. The man who had terrorized Spain for 6 years reduced himself to a sobbing, incoherent wreck when faced with the possibility of losing power. When French forces restored Ferdinand to absolute power in 1823, he returned not as a triumphant monarch, but as a broken man whose paranoia had metastasized into complete madness. He began executing people for crimes that existed only in his imagination, issuing contradictory orders that revealed a mind no longer capable of rational thought, and retreating deeper into a fantasy world where everyone was plotting against him because everyone actually was plotting against him. The man who had betrayed his father, exploited women, tortured prisoners, and murdered wives had finally created the reality he had always feared. By 1830, Ferdinand VII truly was surrounded by enemies, not because of some grand conspiracy, but because his own actions had turned every decent person in Spain into someone who wished he was dead. Ferdinand VII's final years were a grotesque spectacle of a monster slowly consuming himself, surrounded by the accumulated horror of 2 decades of systematic cruelty. By 1833, the man who had terrorized an entire nation was reduced to a bloated, paranoid invalid whose own body seemed to be rejecting the evil it contained. But his death would reveal secrets so disturbing that they shocked even those who thought they knew the depths of his depravity. The king's physical deterioration mirrored his moral decay. His body swelled to grotesque proportions, not from natural illness, but from years of gluttony, sexual excess, and the accumulated stress of constantly fearing assassination. His face became so puffy and discolored that courtiers whispered he looked like a corpse that had been left in water too long. The handsome prince who had once charmed European courts was now a bloated nightmare that servants feared to look upon directly. Ferdinand's psychological state in his final months was even more disturbing than his physical appearance. Palace physicians' secret reports describe a man who would spend hours talking to imaginary conspirators, negotiating with hallucinated enemies, and confessing to crimes that even his most horrified subjects hadn't suspected. The king's mind was finally revealing the full catalogue of his atrocities, and the list was longer and more disturbing than anyone had imagined. During his final illness, Ferdinand began experiencing what physicians called episodes of revelation, moments of startling clarity where he would describe in precise detail murders, rapes, and acts of torture that had never been officially recorded. He spoke about servants who had disappeared after witnessing his activities, about political prisoners who had been killed for his personal entertainment, and about sexual assaults that had been covered up by his terrified ministers. The most shocking revelations concerned his wives. In his delirium, Ferdinand provided detailed accounts of how he had systematically poisoned each one, describing their symptoms with the precision of someone who had watched carefully and taken notes. He spoke about timing the doses to maximize their psychological suffering, about enjoying their confusion and terror as they slowly realized what was happening to them, and about the sexual gratification he derived from watching them die. Ferdinand's personal confessor, Father Miguel Gomez, left behind sealed testimony that wasn't opened until the 20th century. According to Gomez, Ferdinand's final confessions included admissions of over 200 murders, dozens of rapes, and acts of torture so creative and cruel that the priest initially refused to believe them. But Ferdinand's detailed knowledge of victims' final moments, their last words, and the locations of their bodies convinced Gomez that every confession was true. The dying king also revealed the existence of secret chambers beneath the royal palace, where he had conducted his most extreme experiments on political prisoners and kidnapped civilians. These underground torture complexes, which Ferdinand had designed personally, included devices that combined sexual torture with systematic murder, creating deaths so prolonged and agonizing that even experienced Inquisition torturers had refused to operate them. When Ferdinand finally died on September 29, 1833, his death throes were so violent that physicians initially suspected poisoning. But the autopsy revealed something far more disturbing. His internal organs were so damaged by years of excess and stress that they had essentially been rotting inside his living body for months. His liver was described as liquefied, his heart was enlarged to nearly twice normal size, and his brain showed signs of advanced syphilitic damage that explained his final years of increasing madness. But the most horrifying discovery came when palace officials began cleaning out Ferdinand's private apartments. Hidden behind false walls and sealed in secret compartments, they found his personal collection of trophies from his victims. Jewelry from his murdered wives, preserved body parts from torture victims, detailed sketches of sexual assaults, and written descriptions of his most creative murders, all carefully catalogued like a museum exhibition of human evil. The Spanish government immediately classified these discoveries as state secrets, but word leaked out through surviving servants and horrified officials. European courts received reports describing Ferdinand's collection as evidence that Spain had been ruled not by a human being, but by something genuinely monstrous. The man they had known as a cruel king was revealed to have been a serial killer, rapist, and torturer whose scope of evil dwarfed anything in recorded history. Ferdinand VII's death marked the end of absolute monarchy in Spain, not through political revolution, but through sheer moral exhaustion. No one could advocate for unlimited royal power after witnessing what those powers had enabled. The Spanish people didn't just reject Ferdinand's political system, they rejected the very concept that any human being should wield the kind of absolute authority that had allowed such systematic evil to flourish. The irony was perfect and terrible. Ferdinand VII, who had spent his entire reign obsessing about preserving royal power and dynastic authority, had so completely poisoned the concept of monarchy that his death essentially ended the Spanish royal system's moral legitimacy forever. The man who had betrayed everyone in his desperate quest for absolute power had ultimately betrayed the very institution he claimed to serve. In the end, Ferdinand VII achieved a kind of immortality, but not the glorious historical legacy he had craved. He became a cautionary tale about what happens when power is given to someone completely devoid of human conscience, a reminder that the greatest threats to civilization often come not from foreign enemies, but from the monsters we allow to rule over us. His death freed Spain from a nightmare, but the scars he left on the Spanish psyche would last for generations, a permanent reminder of how evil absolute power can become when wielded by hands that have never learned the meaning of mercy.